The medieval crusader didn't just carry weapons, they wielded instruments of destruction so perfectly engineered for killing that their very names still send chills down historians' spines. These weren't crude chunks of metal swung by desperate men. These were precision tools of war, forged by master craftsmen and wielded by warriors who spent decades perfecting the art of ending human lives. Let me paint you the real picture of what Crusader weaponry actually was. We're not talking about clunky swords and primitive shields. We're talking about a technological arms race that produced weapons so effective they fundamentally changed how humans killed each other for centuries. The Crusades weren't just religious wars. They were a laboratory of death where European, Byzantine and Islamic military technologies collided, merged and evolved into something terrifying. The weapons that emerged from this crucible were so advanced, so brutally efficient that they make modern combat knives look like children's toys. And here's what makes this truly shocking. These medieval warriors didn't have gunpowder, no explosives, no modern metallurgy. Yet they created weapons that could punch through the most advanced armor of their time, shatter bones with single strikes and deliver death with surgical precision. The archaeological evidence from Crusader battlefields reveals wounds so devastating that forensic experts struggle to understand how humans could survive long enough to receive multiple injuries. But we're going to start with the weapon that defined an entire era of warfare. The weapon that became so synonymous with medieval combat that its very shape was considered sacred. The Crusader sword wasn't just a weapon, it was a statement of faith forged in steel. When a medieval knight drew his sword, he wasn't just preparing for battle, he was literally holding the cross in his hands. The crossguard of every Crusader sword deliberately echoed the shape of Christ's crucifixion, transforming every blade into a religious icon that could split a man's skull. Archaeological evidence shows us that these weren't the crude iron bars you see in movies. Crusader swords were marvels of medieval engineering. The typical knightly sword measured between 70 to 80 centimeters in length, perfectly balanced for single-handed use while maintaining devastating cutting power. But here's where it gets truly impressive. The steel quality varied dramatically depending on origin, creating a hierarchy of death that determined battlefield outcomes. European sword makers, particularly those in Toledo, had been perfecting their craft since Roman times. Their blades could hold an edge, sharp enough to slice through mail armor while remaining flexible enough to withstand the tremendous forces of combat. But even Toledo's steel paled in comparison to what Crusaders encountered in the East. Damascus steel. The mere mention of this material struck terror into European hearts. Imported from southern India and Sri Lanka, this steel called woots possessed properties that seemed almost supernatural to medieval eyes. When forged properly, Damascus steel blades showed distinctive watery patterns in the metal, created by the fibrous layout of crystals that made them incredibly sharp and remarkably durable. Crusading knights began bringing woots steel back to Europe in the 11th century, but the secret of its creation remained locked in India until the 19th century. Imagine facing an opponent whose blade could cut through your finest armor while yours bounced harmlessly off his. This technological gap wasn't just about superior weapons. It was about psychological warfare that could break entire armies before the first blow was struck. But the sword was just the beginning. Medieval warfare demanded weapons that could overcome increasingly sophisticated armor, and Crusader weaponsmiths responded with innovations that redefined battlefield lethality. Enter the mace. If the sword was the weapon of nobility, the mace was the democratization of medieval destruction. Here was a weapon so brutally simple that even untrained soldiers could wield it with devastating effect. No years of sword training required. No complex techniques to master, just raw kinetic energy focused through a small surface area, capable of crushing skulls and shattering bones regardless of armor. The basic ball mace consisted of a wooden handle topped with a metal sphere, but medieval engineers quickly realized they could amplify its destructive potential. Flanged maces featured metal protrusions designed specifically to concentrate force and penetrate armor joints. Spiked maces could punch through steel plate with enough force to reach vital organs beneath. Knobbed maces delivered multiple simultaneous impacts, turning a single swing into a barrage of bone-crushing blows. But here's what made the mace truly terrifying. Unlike swords, which required precision and technique, the mace was about overwhelming force. Archaeological studies of Crusader battlefield remains show skull fractures so severe that modern forensic experts classify them as unsurvivable. These weren't clean deaths. They were systematic destructions of human anatomy achieved through superior weapon design. The psychological impact was equally devastating. The sound of a mace connecting with armor created a distinctive crushing noise that experienced warriors learned to fear. That sound meant someone's war was over permanently. Yet even the mace paled in comparison to what medieval weaponsmiths created when they combined multiple weapon systems into single tools of destruction. The battle axe represented this evolution perfectly. Roughly the same size as a sword, the battle axe was cheaper to produce and required minimal training to use effectively, but its killing potential far exceeded either characteristic. What made the battle axe a battlefield favorite was its dual nature. The concentrated weight of the axe head could crush armor and break bones through pure force, but the sharpened edge could also slice through mail and leather with devastating efficiency. Contemporary accounts describe battle axes cutting through limbs so cleanly that victims initially didn't realize they'd been wounded until they tried to move the severed appendage. The versatility was unmatched. Crusader battle axes could hook shields, pull riders from horses, crush helmets, and deliver precise strikes to armor joints where other weapons failed. Medieval combat manuals describe specific techniques for using the battle axe to systematically dismantle an opponent's defenses before delivering the killing blow. But medieval weapons technology didn't stop at individual tools of destruction. As armor became more sophisticated, weaponsmiths responded with innovations that combined multiple weapon systems into single instruments of overwhelming lethality. The pole axe. No other medieval weapon strikes more terror into the hearts of historians who understand what it actually was. This wasn't just another battlefield tool. This was medieval military engineering pushed to its absolute limits, creating what combat experts describe as the most devastating anti-armor weapon ever conceived by human minds. Picture this. You're facing a fully armored knight protected by the finest plate armor money could buy. Your sword bounces off harmlessly. Your mace can't find a gap. You're about to die. Then someone hands you a poleaxe, and suddenly that impenetrable opponent becomes vulnerable in ways that would make modern special forces operators envious. The poleaxe represented the ultimate evolution of medieval weapon design. Unlike crude clubs or simple axes, this was precision engineering that combined multiple weapon systems into one instrument of systematic destruction. The typical poleaxe measured between 4 and 7 feet in length, but that measurement tells you nothing about its true lethality. At the business end, you had an axe blade capable of cutting through steel plate. Mounted opposite was a hammerhead designed specifically to crush armor and the bones beneath. Projecting from the top was a thrusting spike that could punch through the strongest mail with surgical precision. This wasn't random weapon design. This was calculated engineering that addressed every possible defensive strategy an opponent might employ. But here's where medieval weaponsmiths showed their true genius. The entire head was reinforced with long metal strips called langettes, riveted directly to the wooden shaft. These weren't decorative elements. They were defensive systems designed to prevent enemy weapons from chopping through the pole during combat, ensuring the poleaxe remained functional even under sustained attack. The psychological impact was overwhelming. Medieval combat manuals describe the poleaxe as capable of smashing, cutting, prying, piercing, tearing, hooking, levering, and crushing. Imagine facing an opponent whose single weapon could counter every defensive strategy you possessed. The term poleaxed originated in the 15th century when captives were routinely executed with poleaxe blows to the head, and it perfectly captures the weapon's devastating effectiveness. Archaeological evidence from Crusader battlefields reveals the horrifying efficiency of poleaxe combat. Skeletal remains show precise strikes that targeted specific armor joints with surgical accuracy. These weren't wild swings, they were calculated attacks that exploited known weaknesses in defensive systems, delivered by warriors who understood human anatomy better than most modern doctors. The training required to master the poleaxe was equally intense. Medieval combat treatises describe it as the ultimate weapon for learning all other medieval combat techniques. Master the poleaxe, they claimed, and you could effectively wield swords, daggers, spears, and single-handed weapons. It was the graduate school of medieval warfare, and graduation meant you could systematically dismantle any opponent regardless of their armor or training. But the true horror of Crusader weaponry wasn't just in individual weapons, it was in how these tools were integrated into coordinated systems of destruction that transformed medieval battlefields into precisely orchestrated killing fields. The crossbow revolution fundamentally changed Crusader warfare in ways that modern military historians are still analysing. Unlike traditional bows that required years of training and tremendous physical strength, the crossbow democratized ranged killing. A peasant with minimal training could now deliver bolts with enough force to punch through the finest armor at ranges that kept him safely away from sword-wielding knights. Medieval crossbow bolts weren't simple arrows, they were engineered projectiles designed specifically to defeat armor. The bolt heads featured various designs optimized for different targets. Bodkin points could penetrate mail armor by spreading the links apart. Broadheads caused massive bleeding in unarmored opponents. Specialized armor-piercing heads concentrated tremendous force into microscopic contact areas, allowing them to punch through steel plate that could deflect sword strikes. The mechanical advantage was staggering. Medieval crossbows could generate draw weights exceeding 1,200 pounds, creating projectile velocities that made them effective at ranges approaching 400 meters. Contemporary accounts describe crossbow bolts punching completely through armored knights and continuing with enough force to wound soldiers standing behind them. But the crossbow's true tactical advantage wasn't just its killing power, it was how it changed battlefield dynamics in ways that terrified traditional military commanders. Suddenly, expensive, highly trained knights could be killed by common soldiers from distances that made retaliation impossible. The entire feudal military system, based on armoured cavalry dominance, found itself vulnerable to peasants with mechanical weapons. The response was predictable and brutal. The church attempted to ban crossbows in 1139, declaring them too inhumane for use against Christians. The ban was routinely ignored because the tactical advantages were simply too overwhelming. Armies that adopted crossbow technology systematically destroyed those that didn't, creating an arms race that pushed medieval weapon development to unprecedented levels of lethality. Medieval siege warfare took this technological evolution even further, creating weapons that could breach the most massive fortifications while delivering destruction on scales that wouldn't be matched until gunpowder artillery. The trebuchet represented medieval engineering at its most terrifying, capable of hurling 300-pound stones over distances approaching 300 meters with enough accuracy to target specific sections of castle walls. But siege weapons weren't just about destroying fortifications, they were psychological warfare tools designed to break enemy morale before physical walls crumbled. Contemporary accounts describe trebuchets launching plague corpses, severed heads, and Greek fire into besieged cities, creating terror that often accomplished more than direct military assault. The technological sophistication was remarkable. Medieval engineers calculated counterweight ratios, projectile trajectories, and structural stresses with mathematical precision that rivals modern engineering. These weren't crude catapults. They were precision instruments capable of delivering devastating payloads with surgical accuracy across battlefield distances. So, the next time you watch a medieval movie and see knights clanking around in crude armor swinging primitive weapons, remember what you've learned today. Those weren't primitive warriors stumbling through the dark ages. They were the products of the most sophisticated military technology development program in human history, wielding weapons that represented centuries of battlefield evolution and engineering refinement. The Crusader arsenal wasn't just about individual weapons, it was about integrated systems of destruction that could adapt to any tactical situation. From the sacred symbolism of the cross-shaped sword to the mechanical precision of siege engines, every piece of equipment represented solutions to specific battlefield problems solved through blood, steel, and relentless innovation. These weapons didn't just kill people. They fundamentally changed how humans approach warfare, created new tactical doctrines, and established technological foundations that influenced military development for centuries. The archaeological evidence speaks for itself. Medieval battlefields weren't places where crude barbarians hacked at each other with primitive tools. They were testing grounds where the most advanced military technologies of their time proved their effectiveness in the most brutal laboratory imaginable. The gap between medieval military capability and modern civilian understanding isn't just significant, it's astronomical. We've gained comfort and safety, but we've lost something fundamental about human potential when survival depends on mastering instruments of war. The Crusader weapons represent what happens when brilliant minds focus entirely on solving the problem of ending human life efficiently. That's a legacy worth remembering, and perhaps one worth respecting.